He said that it was as dangerous to put a book into the hands of an ignorant man as to put a sword into the hands of children. So that books to the ancients were mere makeshifts. In one of his many letters, Seneca wrote against large libraries, and Schopenhauer wrote long afterwards that many people mistook the buying of a book for the buying of the contents of the book. Sometimes, looking at the many books I have at home, I feel I shall die before I have come to the end of them. And yet, I cannot resist the temptation of buying new books. When I walk inside the library, I find a book on one of my hobbies, for example, Old English or Old Norse poetry, and then I say to myself, what a pity I can't buy that book, because I already have a copy at home. And then, after the ancients, there came from the East a different idea of a book. There came the idea of Holy Writ, of books written by the Holy Ghost. There came Korans, Bibles, and so on. And following the example of Spengler in his Untergang des Abendlandes, in his Decline of the West, I shall take the Koran as an example. For, if I am not mistaken, the Muslim theologians think of the Koran as being prior to the creation of the world. The Koran is written in Arabic, but the Muslims think of it as being prior to the language. Indeed, I have read that they think of the Koran not as a work of God, but as an attribute of God, even as his justice or his mercy or his whole wisdom are. And thus there came into Europe the idea of Holy Writ. And this idea is, I think, a not wholly mistaken one. Bernard Shaw, and I am always going back to Bernard Shaw, was asked once whether he really thought that the Bible was the work of the Holy Ghost. And he said, I think the Holy Ghost has written not only the Bible, but all books. This is rather hard on the Holy Ghost, of course, but all books worth rereading, I suppose. And this, I think, is what Homer meant when he spoke to the Muse. And this is what the Hebrews and what Milton meant when they talked of the Holy Ghost, whose temple is the upright and pure heart of men. And in our less beautiful mythology, we speak of the subliminal self, of the subconscious. Of course, those words are rather uncouth if we compare them with the Muses or with the Holy Ghost, but still we have to put up with the mythology of our time. For the word means essentially the same thing. Now, we come to the notion of the classics. But I think that a book is really not an immortal object to be picked up and duly worshipped, but rather an occasion for beauty. And it has to be so, for language is shifting all the time. I am very fond of etymologies, and I may recall to you rather, for I'm sure you know much more about these things than I do, some rather curious etymologies. For example, we have in English the verb to tease. That word is a mischievous word. It means kind of joke. And yet, in Old English, tesan meant to wound with a sword, even as in French, navrer meant to thrust a sword through somebody. Well, let us take a different word, the word threat. Well, in Old English, as you may find out from the very first verses of Beowulf, a threat, a threat, meant an angry crowd. That is to say, the cause of the threat. And thus, we might go on endlessly. But now, let us consider some particular verses. And I take my examples from the English, since I have a particular love for the English literature, though my knowledge is of course limited. There are cases where poetry creates itself. For example, I don't think that the words quietus and bodkin are specially beautiful. Indeed, I should say they were rather uncouth. But if we think of when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin, we are reminded of the great speech of Hamlet, and thus the context creates poetry for those words that no one would ever dare to use nowadays, because they would be mere quotations. And then there are other examples, and perhaps simpler ones. Let us take the title of one of the most famous books in the world, Historia del ingenioso hidalgo Don Quixote, or Don Quixote, as I suppose Cervantes would pronounce it, de la Mancha. Now, the word hidalgo has today a peculiar dignity, all its own, and yet when Cervantes wrote it, the word hidalgo meant, I suppose, a country gentleman. As to the name, Quixote, it was meant to be a rather ridiculous word, as the names of many of the characters in Dickens, names such as Pickwick and Swiveller and Chuzzlewit and Twist, and it is so, and Squeers and Quilp, and so on. And then you have de la Mancha. Now this sounds noble and Castilian to us, but when Cervantes wrote it down, he intended the word to sound, perhaps, I ask the apology of any citizen of that city who may be here, as if he wrote Don Quixote of Kansas City. And yet, nowadays, I'm not speaking against Kansas. Let us say Pehuajó or Buenos Aires. And yet, you see how those words have changed, how they have been ennobled. You see the strange fact